Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Today, it's a special triumvirate, if you will. It's me, E.C. Darlingbond, Dylan Holzmer, and Robert Koshu, coming to you here from the Middle Ages. Today, Dylan is leading our expedition to reclaim the Holy Land, as it were, in this time with the fabulous Baldwin IV. But Dylan, would you like to lay out the prospects before us?
Sure. So the setting is the late 12th century. We are in the Kingdom of Heaven, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin, the Leper King, is somehow not dead, even though he keeps getting worse. Baldwin IV, to kind of set up our fork, was the king of Jerusalem in the late 12th century. On his deathbed, essentially from the moment he took the throne, everybody kind of knew what was going to happen. He did not have any kids of his own. What ended up happening in the real timeline is he gets diagnosed. He tries to marry his sister to a guy named William of Montferrat, who ends up dying of malaria after about a year of their marriage, manages to get Sibylle pregnant. So there is a presumptive heir to the throne. But William of Montferrat dies. Then Guy de Lusignan and Reynald of Chatillon, who we will discuss in more detail later, end up basically being the bulls in the china shop that wreck the Kingdom of Jerusalem and start causing all kinds of problems. There's a failed attack on Saladin in Egypt, and essentially Guy de Lusignan becomes Baldwin's last hope at any kind of stability in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Guy de Lusignan then takes the Crusader army after Baldwin V, William of Montferrat's son, and the second king of Jerusalem in our timeline dies after about a year of even presumptive kingship, even though he's got a regency. Guy de Lusignan decides to walk his entire army up onto a barren plateau where Saladin has cut off all of the water supplies. You can imagine in a desert in the Levant, that's probably not a great way to start a battle. And then Saladin promptly defeats Guy de Lusignan in battle and essentially destroys the Kingdom of Jerusalem right then and there in 1187. The fork is that what if this character, William of Montferrat, did not die of malaria in 1177? What if he lived, for another decade or two and basically provided a figure of stability for the Kingdom of Jerusalem that is very much in need of a figure of some stability at this point in time? So that's kind of where we're sitting right now. And just to give you a bit of background on William of Montferrat and who this guy is, he was known as the Longsword. I love these medieval names. Everybody's the Great or the Fat or the Bald or the Longsword or the Confessor, just the most descriptive names you can imagine. He is a surprisingly well-connected figure. He's a cousin of King Henry II of England, King Louis VII of France, Frederick Barbarossa, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This is a guy who's got all of the connections in his back pocket if you ever need him. But he ends up dying before he can really, help out other than just getting Sibylle pregnant. The way that I kind of see the beginnings of the fork, if William of Montferrat survives April of 1177, Baldwin IV was planning an attack on Saladin, who had just taken over the Fatimid Sultanate in Egypt for that summer and early fall. So with William of Montferrat out of the picture, now he's got other generals that he's got to rely on. The attack ends up falling apart. Some of the Byzantines and other allies basically back out because they don't trust some of the other allies. But William of Montferrat's relations to all these, different cousins who are kings on the thrones of Europe may provide just enough stability for the Byzantines not to back out and this attack to go forward. It doesn't necessarily have to completely wipe Saladin out, but it provides enough of a roadblock on Saladin's road to consolidation that it may essentially allow the kingdom to survive a little bit longer.
Okay, so we have the suggestively named William Longsword of Montferrat uh, surviving his malaria. Before we continue, I just want to wish a happy Pride Month to all of our fans and listeners out there in the community. I have some siblings and relatives of my own, so celebrating you all. Thank you for listening. Now, Robert, what
Yes.
do you know of this time period? So
So
this would
this
be
time-
right before the Third Crusade, if I'm
Correct. This is after the Second Crusade. They've established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This is about the fourth ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem as they've gone through and moved forward with it. And so now we're at a point where Saladin is really starting to make himself known. He is the Muslim leader who has decided he's going to be the one that takes back the kingdom of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from the infidels, as the Muslims would call them, to really reestablish and get the Temple Mount back. The Temple Mount, remember, is where Muhammad left the earth. So we need to get that back. And so we're at the point now where they're really settling up to move forward. And Saladin is the latest of the Muslim leaders, but he's also the strongest as he's come through. He's coming out of Egypt. And so he is he is the first legitimate threat since they established the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so that is really where the setup begins. And what I find interesting is Longsword is there. And if he's there, I'm totally in agreement that, first of all, Longsword would not have been stupid enough, and I'm just going to say that from a military history perspective, to run my men up onto a plateau with no water on it prior to a battle. That is just that is, hey, I'm going to be up here so you can lay siege to me and defeat me language. It's akin to in Texas history, we lose the Battle of Goliad because Fannin retreats up to a creek and stops with the creek at his back. You have nowhere to go at that point.
So essentially getting backed into a corner.
Oh, yeah.
Now, just to provide some background on our major players. So beforehand, we have Baldwin IV. He is the leper king of Jerusalem. And basically nobody wanted him to be king initially because of his leprosy. Though he only had a dead right arm, people thought, well, maybe it's something else, but then it wasn't something else.
They hid it.
Yeah, and it essentially turns into the medieval equivalent of the dating game, where he is trying to find anyone to marry one of his siblings, Sibella, who is his full-blooded sister, as in they share the same parentage, but their parents annulled their marriage before his father became king of Jerusalem. I believe Almeric was his dad. Almeric was saying, let's try to find somebody else who can replace my son, but then he died, and then Baldwin kind of takes the quest up for a decade, much longer than anyone would expect a very stressed out person to survive with leprosy, trying to find somebody who everybody can agree to, because he really wants to retire. Like, I think that's pretty much the whole thread throughout his reign of, can anybody else take this job that won't cause massive disruption to the project of keeping the Holy Land? Dylan, Robert, would you say that is a fair assessment?
Yeah, it's the dating game, because remember, the number one rule of all royalty females is to birth the heir and the spare.
Exactly. And while Jerusalem could have queens, they needed to at least be married.
Yep.
And share that, if I'm remembering
Yeah.
correctly.
Yep.
And it's important to remember that, like, Jerusalem was not, when we look back at the Middle Ages, we think of this sort of the modern understanding of primogeniture. Okay, the oldest son inherits the whole shebang. It really wasn't like that in Jerusalem. What they had is they had a high council that essentially it was kind of understood that it was all going to stay in the familial line of succession, but the exact priority was kind of flexible. That actually is how Amalric basically got the throne and had to get, divorce or get annulled from Baldwin and Sibylla's mother, is because the nobles basically said, hey, we're cool with you, she's got to go. And that was kind of his condition. So there's also this constant, I was reading one source that talked about how they have basically what amount to all these Italian gigolos that are just coming in, trying to marry everybody, trying to get rich. So it's almost like a dating game show in terms of like trying to get Sibylla married off, and who are you going to find that's actually going to work?
Except this time you're trying to find a serial killer because this person needs to be a warrior of some sort. Now, we have Guy de Lusignan, who is a first cousin of Henry II, or is he a cousin of Richard I? Exactly. Like, he is tied into the Plantagenets of England and their French possessions.
Yeah, so Guy de Lusignan is actually basically, he's kind of a noble of some renown, but he's more in kind of the Italian area. He's sort of like a French Norman, and he's basically kind of a jumped up upstart that he's got some distant relation to the House of Anjou and some of the other ruling houses. But William of Montferrat is a direct first cousin to the three primary rulers of Western Europe, which is, Henry II Plantagenet, who starts essentially the peak of the Angevin, kings of England, Louis VII of France, and probably the most famous Holy Roman Emperor of all time, Frederick Barbarossa. So he's much more well connected than the guy who ends up becoming the final king of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan. Guy is basically, I heard one guy basically call him one of these gigolos that sort of comes in and tries to marry his way into the roulette wheel.
Yes, Guy, as I was saying before we started, is somehow the worst and yet still survives for a long time because he seems to Baldwin just can't seem to get rid of him for some reason or another. But the other main player who we need to talk about is Sibylla, who is the full-blooded sister who married Guy in our timeline after being widowed by William. And even though she becomes Queen of Jerusalem, from what I've read, she wasn't an Eleanor of Aquitaine who was looking to be her own power. Rather, she was much more comfortable by having somebody else take the lead. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, she was primarily known for just kind of basically following along with whatever her mother kind of wanted, who was this much more sort of Eleanor of Aquitaine kind of power player behind the scenes, and sort of just kind of following along with whatever, the person in charge kind of really told her to do, at least from what I've read.
Yeah, the ideal medieval bride, according to the royals of the time. Understood. And essentially, we have it to where both camps. So we're talking about Saladin, whose name is very complicated, so we're going to call him Saladin, even though other people might have familiarly called him, hey, it's Yusuf, it's Joe. We're going with Saladin, and then we have Baldwin IV later in our new timeline, William of Montferrat, and they're both leaders by consensus. Would that be fair to say? They're both relatively in the same position to where they have a mission, keep the Holy Land, take the Holy Land, ideally Jerusalem being the number one city of importance. And they both have patrons on both sides because they both have to sell themselves as, I will take back the holy city, or I will keep the holy city. Please send money. Please send troops. Arguably, Saladin is in a better position because he's also the Sultan of the Ayyubid dynasty with holdings in Egypt. So he has his home country next door to him that he is arguably the ruler of, but is almost always having to think about the Crusades and the Crusader kings.
Yeah, because the Crusades are coming to take the Holy Land no matter what at that point.
Yeah, and in our timeline, when he does take Jerusalem, it is almost catastrophic for him because then everybody of his patrons, all of these differing Muslim kingdoms who are either Sunni or Shiite, who don't love the fact that he's Kurdish, among many things, say like, well, we now have Jerusalem. We will stop sending troops. We will stop sending money. And he has to say, oh, please, please keep sending this or else we're going to lose it to more Normans. So we have William of Longsword of Montreal. Can you say that for me one more time? What is
Montferrat?
Montferrat. So we have William of Montferrat now in the leading position. His first son, Baldwin V, has passed away due to leprosy. He's married to Sibylla. He is now the king. He does not get malaria. We have Saladin there as the leader of the Muslim force. And we still have other characters like Guy de Lucian in the background, who's just like, oh, I could have been the king. We have Reynard of, where was Reynard from?
Chatillon, which is some town somewhere in France, I think.
Right. And he was basically a land pirate, as far as I've heard it described. Like, Baldwin would keep trying to make peace deals with Saladin because they were both in this continual stalemate of just, well, one has resources, but the other one has the holy city and a port by the sea, and they're just constantly like angling in this weird dance. And Reynard keeps messing things up by attacking Muslim pilgrimages who are trying to visit Jerusalem. And Jerusalem itself is not a profitable city for traditional farming. They basically are. It's basically if Disneyland was a religious experience. Like you're making your money off people coming to see your city.
Yeah, there is no real farming capability near Jerusalem. Geography just doesn't let it happen. And so Jerusalem sits up on a hill surrounded by lower pieces geographically. And so because of development and other things, farming there is limited, and it had really been established as a cultural, religious, economic city since really the Roman times and before the Romans even. So just it's one of those cities that's in a really unique place where nothing is going to affect one way or the other. So I have a thought I want to throw out. Does Baldwin IV abdicate immediately upon the birth of Baldwin V and let William basically be the regent running the place? I think that's a possibility completely, particularly if his leprosy has really progressed. So he basically abdicates and William becomes, for all practical purposes, he's the regent, but Longsword becomes the king of Jerusalem for all practical purposes at that point.
Yeah, actually, when I was kind of reading some background, he actually did ask William of Montferrat if he would be willing to assume the throne if he abdicated when they first proposed the marriage. I think at the time he had some pushback from some of the other nobles, but I think if you get into a situation where he's living longer than, a year into the marriage and he proves some stability, especially in military campaigns, I think you can certainly say he would be very akin to the way Baldwin would have ruled, and he would have, I think, made a very good regent, and then eventually outright king, assuming Baldwin V does only survive a year. I think the nobles, he's kind of the perfect person to spot into that slot where the nobles are happy with him. He's got enough connections. He has enough diplomatic ties to where he can ostensibly, as long as he doesn't die of malaria, keep the wheels turning and keep everything rocking and rolling in the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Okay, so we have Baldwin IV officially stepping down as King of Jerusalem. He says, this has been great. This was a nightmare of a job to deal with. And even though I'm good at this, I didn't want to be. My brother-in-law, Billy Longsword, is now the king. All hail Bill. And I'm going to retire. Cheers. Saladin now has a new opponent on the field, William of Montferrat, as the king of Jerusalem. So that's going to change his calculations. And Dylan, I believe you were going to lead us in the attempted invasion of Egypt, if you will.
Yeah, so in early 1177, when William of Montferrat dies in our timeline, there's this big planned invasion of Egypt because Saladin originally was sort of Turkish origin, sort of kind of off, up in the Anatolian plain and Syria, sort of on the north end of Jerusalem. But there had been this Fatimid caliphate that was centered in Egypt. And I'm the name of the caliph is escaping me, but Saladin had actually essentially been this guy's right-hand man, his lead general. And the old Fatimid caliph had essentially he'd conquered a couple cities, done some cool stuff, and kind of then sat back on his laurels. Saladin actually basically usurped power from him right at the end of his life. And so this kind of, and this was in 1170, I think, when Saladin did this. So this is kind of an early important consolidation period for Saladin to get all of his power combined. Because like you said, he's got a lot of different people he's got to please. So an invasion of Egypt by the Crusader states at this kind of key moment before he's really consolidated his power would have been potentially one of the things to really kind of put a stop to him. I don't know that it would have outright taken him out of power, but it certainly would have put him on the back foot, having to react instead of trying to, essentially go and come and take back the holy city of Jerusalem. The Byzantines, assuming the attack on Egypt succeeded, would probably have taken over the city of Alexandria as some sort of, port city on the Nile and the Mediterranean, based on their old historic claims under the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. So if this invasion does succeed, Jerusalem is safe from, Muslim invaders for another 10 or 15 years until they can get their act together. You've got new Byzantine strength on the Egyptian coast. And I think that potentially opens up not just some diplomatic possibilities, but some interesting economic possibilities because of where Jerusalem and the other Crusader states and Egypt especially are situated in terms of the axis of medieval Europe versus, medieval India and the Orient. I think there's some interesting trade possibilities that could get opened up there.
So do you propose that you could see Egypt maybe not taking the form of how a lot of these European nobles were to their own fiefdoms, to where it was very agrarian based, but maybe something more akin to an Italian city-state, such as Venice, to where the main facet of our industry is now trade. That is something we can go into now instead of just relying on money people are paying going on these pilgrimages to the holy city.
I think William manages to negotiate out, like you said, deals with the county of Tripoli. So now we've got a port, a real port.
Yeah, because that's really the key for Jerusalem, is having some kind of port that they can functionally use reliably.
Okay,
and
Dylan, go on.
No. I was just going to say, and that deals with two problems. One, Jerusalem getting a port, consolidation with Tripoli, but also the Byzantines have kind of slowly been losing power, but nobody realizes it yet. Because the First Crusade was called essentially at the behest of a Byzantine emperor, saying, "Hey, come help me, please. I'm getting attacked." And there's this fascinating thing that's happening in the kind of 12th century of Byzantine politics, where, especially once the Crusader states start, they're doing all this stuff. They're trying to make these alliances. They're bankrolling some of these trips almost out of necessity, because they're trying to look more imposing than they really are behind the scenes to get the help that they need to fight off some of these attacks, especially by the Seljuks up in Anatolia. So this win also gives the Byzantines a significant strengthening of their sort of position behind the scenes, and potentially allows them to sort of not have to worry so much about, Saladin and some of the other attacks in the south where Jerusalem is, and focus more on sort of the Seljuk Turks and eventually the Khwarezmians in sort of Anatolia and in Persia, maybe.
Okay, so this attack on Egypt, the capture of Alexandria, that essentially exterminates the possibility of a third crusade. So we may not have Richard the Lionheart having to then come to try and take Jerusalem from Saladin. Would you say that is correct?
As much as it pains me to admit that might eliminate the legend of Robin Hood, yeah, that's probably a pretty fair bet.
Poor Richard. He hated England. He was always trying to get away. Once said he would sell England if he could, just to be a professional soldier, which ruins my comparison to the city of Tiberias, named after a Roman emperor who really didn't want to be one. So there's that out of the episode. But so we now no longer have a third crusade, so we don't have that rivalry between Philip and Richard, both having to be in Jerusalem at roughly the same time, so neither one invades the other's holdings in France. Frederick Barbarossa probably doesn't drown while swimming. I'm just saying, make sure this summer you have somebody watching the pool. Somebody who is not inebriated watching the pool. That's just a safety tip from here in Arizona. And we essentially don't have the power struggle. We are seeing more or less of a condensed nobility behind the project of William trying to now have a new heir to the throne after his firstborn son dies. Now, do you think he and Sibylla are able to have another child before she passes away?
I would say, I mean, just based on history, more in all likelihood, yes, because she did actually end up having other children. I think she got remarried 2 or 3 times between William of Montferrat and Guy de Lusignan, and she had several children in there. They were just, they were infants essentially, and so they basically didn't come into the power struggle by the time the kingdom was essentially lost in our timeline. And plus, Billy Longsword clearly got his name for a reason, and he did manage to get Baldwin V in the oven in the year between when they got married and when he died of malaria. So I think at least there's a significant likelihood that there are multiple other potential heirs.
They're heirs.
Yeah, whether it's Baldwin VI or William II, or if it's a female heir, there's going to be possibilities. I think the kingdom at least survives for. Yeah, I think you could at least say the kingdom survives another generation. Although anything beyond that, it gets questionable.
Yeah. After all, Baldwin did select that subscription option on Only French, the premier nobility of Europe. But, so, William Longsword, unknown longsword heir who will eventually take over, provided nothing terrible happens. And we have Saladin. Do you think Saladin remains in his position as leader of the jihad against the Normans, or do you think that project now is just decided on, okay, everybody's now for themselves if they want to take the Holy City?
I think Saladin is still around. He's just delayed.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he's at least still around. I don't know that he's kind of the monolithic presence. I think, it's going to end up kind of being, one of those things where he's one general that's got these plans, but there may be 2 or 3 others that pop up, from the various other power centers. But I certainly don't think he just goes away. I don't think he disappears from the stage of history just because of this.
Yeah. If the only thing I was willing to suggest as an alternative is maybe his brother Aladil takes over for him, much as he did in rulership of the Ayyubid dynasty in our own timeline. And Aladil was, according to the sources, hot. Like, everybody really liked him, especially the Crusaders, because they all thought of oh, he's just the example of a chivalrous king. He's a sportsman. He's funny. We just all really like him. Richard I actually tried to get Aladil to marry his sister and make them the new rulers of Jerusalem at one point, with the idea that the Muslims would hold the city and the Christian army would be outside the city's walls as a power-sharing agreement. The only thing that went wrong was Aladil didn't want to convert to Christianity, as part of that agreement, though there was a lot of thinking hard about it of just like, well, is this a solution that everybody can live with?
Yeah, and I think that kind of gets at one of the most significant questions of like the long-term stability and existence of Jerusalem. Like what this is in real life, we had a couple of crusades after this when Jerusalem fell. Do you think we're going to have more crusades for some of the other outlying regions, because of this sort of victory in Egypt? Or do you think we're going to see sort of a slow, stagnant decline instead of just kind of a snuffing the candle out, that Guy de Lusignan caused when the kingdom was, instead of being destroyed in a battle, they just kind of get chipped away and withered, and eventually the power politics of medieval Europe just cause them to get put on the back burner until they sort of fade out. And what do you think the long-term prospects are?
Depends. Do we want to save the world or destroy it? We're in a complicated position because because even from its inception, this has been a war both of religious fervor, yes, but also political maneuvering, because Alexius Komnenos of the Byzantines was really just trying to take back Byzantine territory and said to the Pope, yeah, I'll try to fix the schism between the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. And the Pope was just trying to still be the Pope instead of the anti-Pope. So how much of it all gets into this question of, so what's taking precedence? Is it personal power? Is it religious favor? Is it something else? That's kind of the messy thing about the Crusades. I mean, some of the Crusades didn't even take place in Jerusalem, like the Fourth Crusade. That just turned into a weird salary dispute.
National Lampoon's Byzantine Vacation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, that's kind of the interesting thing, because that's one of the fascinating things about this family, the House of Montferrat, is they're so plugged in, not just William, but all of the siblings. They're so plugged into all of the other things that happen in this era of medieval politics. I mentioned before we started that like his brother Conrad in the real timeline eventually basically becomes the king of Jerusalem after the Third Crusade, and they kind of reconstitute the kingdom. One of his other brothers actually became, the husband of, at one point, the heir apparent to the Byzantine emperor. The family was executed as part of this whole convoluted, one might even say Byzantine murder, succession plot. But if William of Montferrat is in the picture, one of the main reasons that his brother Renier was killed along with his Byzantine empress heiress wife is because they didn't have anywhere to go other than the Hagia Sophia to run around when the other claimants came in. So if she can, if Renier can escape to a Jerusalem that's ruled by someone from the House of Montferrat, there may be some interesting, interdynastic, it kind of, Jerusalem versus the Byzantines could become sort of our version of what in real life was the constant battles between England and France over the throne of France and the Angevins, because you just turn the poles and move the map a little bit, but you still have this dichotomy between the Byzantine Empire and the kings of Jerusalem in the House of Montferrat. That's kind of, a stretch, but it could set up some interesting power dynamics for the next 100 years.
Yeah.
In the words of Highlander, the Montferrats end up in charge. I mean, that's really, really the end of it is they end up a more powerful family than they were in our timeline, because they almost have a dynasty at this point.
Yeah. Well, and you kind of start wondering what, if a consolidated House of Montferrat on the throne of Jerusalem, what does that do to some of the other conflicts? Like he's Henry II's cousin. He's the cousin of the King of France. Like which side of that inevitable fight does he decide to come in on? Do you end up having not necessarily a dual monarchy of England and France, but do you have sort of two different branches of the Angevins? Do you have the House of York on the English throne and the House of Lancaster on the French throne or something, some weird butterfly effect like that? There is one other thing that I kind of thought of, just because this like 40-year timeline that we've got where we're talking about is like full of, it's like the NBA dream team of medieval kings and generals. Because, if you say Jerusalem survives, another 30, 40 years, William of Montferrat, he's probably gone by the time you get into the 1200s, because his whole family pretty much dies in the 1190s. But his heir could very much, be ruling for another 10 or 20 years after that. Well, what happens in 1220 in this same sort of ballpark that we're playing around in? A guy named Genghis Khan starts blowing things up left and right. So one of the things that I was kind of curious about was, what does a Western Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Levant do when Genghis Khan shows up on the scene?
I like in your notes, Dylan, you put that, do the Europeans pay more attention?
Yeah, and that was kind of the thing, because even while the Crusades were going on, there was this whole, I don't know if you guys know a whole lot about the sort of myth of Prester John, this sort of, pseudo mythic fabled king in the East of this magical Christian kingdom that was going to swipe all the infidels away.
I believe you mean the king of Ethiopia.
Yeah, that's what it actually was. But
much
it's one
to
of
the
those
annoyance of the Ethiopians. I'm just like, we're not Prester John.
But there were some theories, at one point, that they were actually talking about, when they heard these rumblings of this mythical king in the East, that they were actually talking about the Mongols as they started sweeping across. I'm curious, just because, by the time the Mongols essentially had free reign from basically everywhere from Baghdad to Moscow and Kiev without the Europeans really caring. They didn't necessarily put any stock in it. It was the Muslims' problem. It was the sort of hillbillies in the Russian steppes problem. But if you have even if the Mongols don't get to Jerusalem, just having somebody in the neighborhood that says, these guys just blew up the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, they might be a problem, gives the European sort of primary powers, 10 or 15 years head start. So maybe the Mongols don't get into, Bohemia and essentially the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Do they get stopped, kind of on the Ukrainian steppes? I don't know that there's anything they can do, but I think it's an interesting possibility.
I have a very fun theory. Francis of Assisi, the saint, instead of trying to convert Aladdin, he tries to convert Genghis Khan.
That would be very entertaining, at the very least, if not just fascinating from a religious and sort of cultural. Like, what would that even look like if, not even Genghis, if somebody in the, rather than like the descendants becoming sort of Muslim in the Ilkhanate and some of those other things, what if we got some Christian Mongols? That'd be kind of interesting.
Well, especially because the Mongols are such a weird group to a medieval Christian understanding. Like, Islam had spread pretty far out into Asia at this point. Like, even some Chinese admirals like Zheng Ji were practicing Muslims while also serving the Chinese court. And so to the Christians, they're like, wait, so are these Muslims? No, they're not Muslims. So they're pagans? No, they're kind of Shintoists. What are Shintoists? Okay, they kind of put a lot of spirit into natural things like mountains and streams and believe in the sacredness of the earth. And the Christians are like, what? What? So they're pagans? I guess you could say they're pagans. So that's just a whole nother extreme of like, I mean, the Muslims are weird to the Christians, at least, but at least they thought Jesus was cool. But these guys have never even heard of Jesus.
Well, and so that's like, if they were going to convert, I would imagine probably, the Mongols that occupied the area around sort of, Moscow and the Kievan Rus would be the ones to convert. I don't know that you can get far enough into the Mongol sort of heartland, but because if you've got Mongol Christian overlords of the Rus, does that mean that the Russians eventually kick them out? Are they a little more okay with them because they at least all believe Jesus is cool, whether that's Orthodox or Christian or whatever?
Yeah,
Do you
and
end
the
up having a
Mongols
proto-Mongol Russian state 200 or
and the
300 years
Mongols
early?
were very big about the whole we don't really care about your religious preference as long as you pay your taxes. You're free to do your own thing. Okay, I guess we'll be Christian if that's what matters so deeply to this populace. Because we had the Mongols in India as the Mughals for a long period of time. They're pretty flexible when it comes to things like this. So, you know what? That's going to be my answer for you, Dylan. By 1250, Jerusalem has fallen to the Mongols.
Oh, now that's even more interesting.
Now that becomes even more interesting because now you've got, instead of 2 players in the Levant, now you've got 3 players.
And does a Mongol conquest of Jerusalem then trigger what would be the equivalent of a third crusade?
Yes.
And interestingly enough, do the Muslims and the Third Crusaders work together to throw the Mongols out?
I think it's at least more of a possibility because, again, you're getting, especially for Jerusalem specifically, you're getting, I think it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but I think it's the only major holy city that is regarded as such by 3 distinct religions.
That is its distinction.
I think you could certainly say, at the very least, some of the other Crusader states aside, the defense of Jerusalem would call all of them and maybe allow them to set a kind of precedent for a sort of co-governance of a reconquered post-new Third Crusade non-Mongol Jerusalem, whether it becomes essentially like a kingdom of the Levant, not Jerusalem specifically, or, I don't know how that would work, but I think that'd be kind of an interesting idea, at least a sort of syncretist, multi-religious Middle East. All because some guys who like to get drunk on goat's milk decided to come down for a party. Yeah. So what else does I think that we've caused some pretty good damage into the timeline. We've got the Mongols conquering Jerusalem, triggering who would lead that Third Crusade then? If you say in the 1220s, I mean that still puts you in not Richard III. Who's underneath that? I'm trying. My kings of Alexis would be able to say.
Yeah, Alexis would know this immediately.
Well, there's also no Magna Carta now.
That was the other thing I was going to bring up is what does the state of our modern conception, of course, the lawyer in me is coming out now. What does the state of our modern legal understanding come to if, Richard isn't out of the picture and King John forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215 by the barons? What happens to the modern conception of a parliament and representative government? Are we ruled by a descendant of King George Washington in America or something? To take it really far out to absurdity. But it's an interesting thought that William of Montferrat not dying of malaria means no Magna Carta.
Yeah. Oh, I have it. The Mongols appoint Maimonides to rule Jerusalem.
That's possible.
Out of a misconception of Jerusalem. Oh, he's Jewish. Jerusalem. He's the now king of Jerusalem.
Well, I mean,
Maimonides hated even being the prince. Under Saladin is now the king. And everybody freaks out.
I think we just created an even more cursed timeline than the one Chris and Eric and I made where Germany wins World War I.
Yeah.
Oh, all right. I think we've done a pretty good amount of damage for today. Do you guys have any final thoughts on this weird, absurd medieval timeline that we've created?
I think
Well,
it's
just for the scoreboard. So we ended up, what year did we start off in?
1177.
77. Yep.
So we started from 1177. We've ended somewhere in the 1220s. The Mongols have taken over Jerusalem because there was no Third Crusade, because William of Montferrat was able to have an heir who was able to continue their lineage. The Byzantines do not take in or do not go over to the Russians for whatever reason, who cannot claim to be a fourth Rome. Saladin does not take over Jerusalem, and perhaps his claim to be the leader of a united Muslim front is taken over by his brother, Aladin. And maybe there's no Magna Carta, so we are unsure about the fate of democracy for future generations. This is the kill count of this week's Fork in Time podcast.
Yeah, I think that that does it. I think we need to get one of those little clicker counters to see how many millions of people we end up accidentally killing as we create these timelines. Robert, what do you think?
I'm thinking that we have tapped this one out, but I love the idea of a Mongol conqueror of Jerusalem. I think that is an intriguing concept that we may have to revisit at some point.
Honestly,
and see how much further it goes down. Yeah, well, because I think it's going to take us down a lot of different paths as you think about it, and I think it's entirely doable at this point because you've got somebody different. That, and if you're named Longsword, avoid the malaria. Because
well, I mean,
you can
with the
father multiple and lead a great military kingdom at the same time.
Well, we haven't discounted the possibility that his long sword may have gotten him in trouble, whether it was malaria or something else. But we'll save that for the next episode because it is fun to go back to the Middle Ages instead of I know we tend to stick around in sort of the 19th to 20th centuries primarily, but it's kind of fun to go further back in time to see what we can do.
Well, thank you again for joining us on A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. We're looking forward to mucking about in the Middle Ages just a little bit longer, and we hope y'all have a great day. And if you find a fork in time, Robert, Dylan, what should you do?
Take it.
Or give it to the Mongols. Anywho, I'm E.C. Darlingbond. Robert
Koshu.
And
I'm Dylan Holzheimer.
Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.